So, yeah, I love that. Okay, so here's a question to fill in our minute. If
Mhm.
you had known one thing that you know now and you didn't know then about how to do at college, what would it be?
Yeah, if I do know, I think that back then I wouldn't have known how many opportunities there were to reach out throughout your college career to collaborate with industry.
Yeah,
Um, I think we think, I know colleges are trying to allow that integration and connection earlier, but I think that there's just an enormous amount of opportunity. And I think sometimes students always think of them as paid internships, but there's so many forms of learning that can occur in industry during the 4 years. And I think that's so important because the ability to innovate really has to have some sort of further knowledge, diverse experience. You have to have some exposure to certain things. So
yeah,
we're one to get that exposure earlier. I think they would look at their classes every day differently
yeah.
and absorb them. So I think that would be one thing I would say. If I wish I would have known then, there's some opportunities there, but that's just first off the top of my head.
I think it's an important one. And so I'm going to go ahead, Abram, and welcome people if I
Yeah.
shall, because that segue into how do we create relationships with people and how do we collaborate. I mean, that's the whole point of this program, is to foster and broker those relationships and help students understand how to enter into them. So we are very pleased, Tony, to have you here today. Audience, welcome. This is Tony Sardella, investor, founder, and vice chairman of evolve24. He is the founder and vice chairman of a company that he founded in 2004, and he guides the company's advancement in artificial intelligence, data, and decision sciences. So Evolve24 is a leader in predictive analytics and decision sciences, and his job is to help create models that drive strategic decision making for companies. The company has been repeatedly ranked among the top big data and analytics company by CIO Magazine and Forrester Research for helping Fortune 500 companies across diverse industry sectors achieve successful growth strategies. And I'll let Tony at some point, we'll ask you who those companies are. So as we introduce, I will give you your weekly did you know innovation fact about Iowa State, which I love. I've had several, here's our did you know innovation fact for this week. Several students approached me and said, innovation for students, by students, with students. What does that mean? And I'm going to give you two examples. One is Reed, Roman, and George, who really are interested in doing civic innovation. They do some work in Africa. They work with a large population there, and they want to be more impactful. They're trying to get resources and have struggled about how to do that. So their solution, first blush, was to start a nonprofit. But sometimes we approach things and say, if I'm hungry, my goal is to start a restaurant. But really, there's something in between. How could we model the in between that would help make them go faster and give them insights? So one of the ways we work with students, for students, by students, is we are starting the first chapter we partnered them with a major civic innovator, Steve Johans, who is with Last Mile Entrepreneur, and he is going to build with them the first charter member club of Last Mile Entrepreneur on our campus. So he will mentor them through this process. And that idea came with students. We collaborated, we created an opportunity that will help them go faster, have more resources, create a better pipeline, bring that innovator entrepreneur into the university. And so these are some of the things that we mean when we say with students, by students, for students. I will now, on that note, do something with Nakaya and with Abram, who are the leads today. Abram is our co-host with the Department of English over communications, and Nakaya works with our university library and is the Director of External Relations. So Abram, back to you, Johnny.
Thank you so much, Karen. Just for everybody in the audience today, we're going to spend a little time in three main areas. We're going to get to know Tony a little bit, how he came to his current position, his journey through education and through taking the leap to being an innovator and entrepreneur. In the middle, we'll talk a little bit about his perspectives on the industry he's in right now and where innovation's happening and what that looks like. And then we'll have time in a third section to really focus on his advice for students as they begin to develop their own journeys. That having been said, we want you to ask questions all along the way. And so I entered into the chat for you some examples of questions that frequently you can ask if you're in any kind of informational interview situation. This follows a time-trusted acronym, TIARA. What are trends in the industry, insights, advice, resources, assignments? So I would suggest as you're listening to Tony talk, if you have an idea that you have a question you could ask that maybe is a combination of something we're talking about and one of those questions, go ahead and drop that in the Q&A, and we'll make sure that we bring that up for Tony to address for us. So I think we can start off first, Tony, by just letting you tell us about yourself. How did you get your start? What was your journey to your current role?
Yeah, sounds great. Well, thanks so much for having an opportunity to connect with your very, very talented and promising students. It's really a pleasure to have a chance to talk about innovation with our next generation of innovators. And so with that, I think a couple of things that might be helpful for yourselves who are participating today to know about my journey that might relate. And the first thing is, my journey didn't start as a data scientist. It didn't start anywhere near where I began to innovate. It started as a toxicologist. I'm a scientist. And my science background started in the field of what's called toxicology, measuring risk. And but through that and the journey I took, I moved into how to apply data science and analytical techniques to better business decisions that allowed businesses to make better products, better business processes, and better innovations around how they bring products to market. So kind of now a little background on that. I was with a company for many years called Monsanto Company. They're a large manufacturer of agricultural and pharmaceutical products. They really struggled to understand concerns and issues when new products were coming to market. And so my journey there was to develop new capabilities that linked analytics to how people behaved and concerns they had, so that they can make better business decisions around how to bring markets to society and bring them to the marketplace. So that's kind of a high level how I came. I was a scientist, then went to work in a large corporation and started working in the field of analytics and data science, which led me to develop new techniques and capabilities. That experience was very helpful. The ability to work in a large corporation that had a lot of exposure to how businesses work proved to be very helpful and foundational to starting evolve24 as a company. I had a better perspective on the problems that corporations faced, the challenges they were trying to solve for, and that guided my thoughts around how to innovate, where to innovate, and what innovations to bring to market. So at a high level, that's kind of the journey around starting Evolve.
Thanks, Tony. That's a great introduction. I wonder, one of the things that's so relatable when we hear these stories is those moments that defined the experience for you. And in particular, we'd love to hear about maybe a moment where you spotted that opportunity and you said, I think I'm ready to make a leap. And then maybe the moment where you knew this was going to work and you really were able to go all in with your effort.
Yeah. So I think the first thing, the moment was, you start off, I was quite young. I was in my mid-20s to late 20s working for this corporation at a senior level. And the major aha I didn't quite appreciate was how hard it was for organizations to grasp the things that society and consumers are concerned about. You might think that's actually something they would fully grasp, but back at that time, it wasn't as easy to fully understand what is it, what are concerns, what are problems that consumers and society want solved. And that was when the light bulb went out, or on, I should say. It was really understanding and recognizing this was not an easy thing for them. And I give this story, I was meeting with different corporations at the time and telling them how we were implementing new innovations to understand people's concerns around biotechnology, agriculture, biotech, pharmaceuticals. And when we were sharing that with different corporations and companies we were partnering with, they said, wow, this is such a powerful capability. We struggle with it too. And these are large Fortune corporations. Walmart was one of them. And, these are McDonald's. And that's when the light bulb went on. This is an area that they were telling me was a problem. And I have to admit, I couldn't believe it would be a problem. You have these thought processes that these organizations and companies are so advanced, and they are, and they're so sophisticated, which they are, but in certain areas. And so it's really an interesting journey to discover the areas that they struggled in and see that as an opportunity for me to innovate a solution that could overcome that problem for them. And, at the time, Walmart was a Fortune 5 and Monsanto was a Fortune 50 and McDonald's was a Fortune 15. So these are large enterprises.
Abram, I might interject. I have a question, Tony. These are big company names. And did you have concerns about how you're going to approach that big problem and how you work with companies that large? Because I know it's a concern with our students is, how do I represent myself if I do have a good idea and I feel pretty confident about it, that's the right thing? How do you engage in those conversations?
Yeah. So, yes, terrified until a certain thing happened. So you're very nervous. You don't quite know. I was not much further along than most of the attendees here and your students. I was only about 5 or 6 years, possibly older than them. And you're very scared because you don't know what is, how you're supposed to behave, what you're supposed to do. But then it changed. See, that mindset focused on me, myself, my views. When it changed is I stopped thinking about myself and I started thinking about what was the change I was trying to create. All of a sudden, when I wasn't me focused and I was outwardly focused, like them focused, I started having a better sense of, why am I doing this? Why is this so important? Well, to me, it became so important because I realized these companies were trying to do well, but didn't know how. And I figured, well, if I provide a solution to them, if I develop these new algorithms that help them understand people's concerns, the outcome will be better products, safer products, better ingredients in products, products with more safeguards, products and solutions that get to the heart of what society and consumers want fixed or addressed. As soon as I started putting myself in a mental framework of, why am I doing this deep inside myself? The fears went away, absolutely went away. I was working on behalf of that other entity, that other stakeholder, not myself. And all of a sudden, I started doing things that I absolutely remember. To your point, Karen, I remember one of the close colleagues at a corporation said, wow, you do things that most people would think were really fearful or risky. And I said, I don't feel they're risky at all. I'm just trying to fulfill the why and answer this area. And I would guide you that if you're starting to feel a little uncomfortable about the call, be yourself, know why you're doing it, resonate with what drives you to do it. And I can assure you, you will feel confidence that you've never seen or felt before. That's how it happened for me. Things didn't seem as scary anymore.
Abram?
I just want to jump in here. Tony, I'd love to hear more about that. You talked about the companies you're working with, they want to do well, but they're not sure how to do that. And I think it might be really helpful for our audience members to get a sense of maybe not all the technical details of how you do your work, but the results you're able to deliver. So if you could give us a sense of a client and a kind of issue you help them with.
Yeah. So, the environment for businesses has greatly changed. Historically, 40 years ago, most corporations are viewed as societal contributors of good. So as that landscape has shifted and companies more than ever operate in what I call a high concern, low trust environment. People are very concerned about what they do, and they don't have a lot of trust for corporations. Corporations have needed to then understand, what are the concerns that we're not understanding? What are the concerns that we're not reflecting into our business operations? And so let me give you an example of those, of what we do from a product. We're able to collect massive amounts of data, look at the language of the data, the text, the words, and areas that they discuss, These could be digital content, commentary, websites, social media, any type of content that's widely available. That content reveals through the conversations, through computers and data science, what are the areas of greatest emotion, greatest concern, greatest importance in general. Then what are they within the auto industry, the food industry, the agricultural industry? What's important there? So our algorithms look at that information. They're able to synthesize and rank the most important areas of concern and interest. Through that, those are fed to companies, and the companies can then make adjustments. So, for example, large food companies like a Nestle, or even food companies like a Purina for pet food, are able then to design products that have different ingredients that reflect concerns that different society will have. And I'll give you a very specific example. It came to be known that people will recognize that your gut health and your mental health are very related. What you eat might affect your mental health. Well, this was of great importance. And so these firms started to develop and understand what are ingredients that would be beneficial to the gut and be from both a health sensitivity or health-centric model, be very effective in being able to foster greater mental health. And Nestle now has a whole institute on gut health where they research these type of areas. Those are findings that massive data analysis allowed the companies to discover and allowed them to do the right thing because that's what they wanted to do. But they just didn't know what that was in the consumer and society's mind.
And Tony, I'm going to hop in with just a question or two. So we have a question from Nathan. And Nathan is wondering about just if you could talk about the process. So from getting the data to implementing the data to finding the solutions, could you give us maybe like a 60,000 foot overview? Because I'm sure it's very, very detailed.
Yeah, no, we'll keep it. We'll go as detailed as one or as high level. Well, the process itself is a massive process of collection. So it sounds like when the individual has a little more technical background. So think of it as a massive collection of data. We're talking billions and billions of pieces of information that are being generated, possibly even this webinar that would make itself available publicly and see what we're discussing, what things really matter to us. That data is all collected, instantaneously analyzed into a variety of analytical techniques. So clustering analysis, semantic analysis. Now we're getting a little technical. In other words, it groups them into topics. It groups them into the amount of motion. It groups them into the words and the sentiment of those. As that is done, those start to be revisualized in different technologies, different visual techniques, so that businesses can take those findings and now start to apply their expertise to the findings so that they can make decisions about their business and their products. I think it's a really important aspect when we're in the field of data science and predictive analytics. One has to grasp that human expertise and judgment of their market is critical into taking the findings and creating innovative products or innovative solutions around the insights that were derived. So technically, large collection, massive computer cloud processing. Ourselves, we use Google Cloud. So they are an incredible big data environment that we leverage to do all the analyses and then visually display it into all sorts of dashboards and pretty charts and beautiful visualizations for businesses to get that information in real time. The difference for those who are more leaning into the data science is the speed of business requires these insights very quickly. If they don't get them quickly, they can't shape the outcome. They can't address it. They can't alter the direction. And as such, they need these findings in very fast real time. So the processes have to be built that way. Hopefully that wasn't too detailed and wasn't too high level, but gave a sense of the process from beginning to end. Now there's a whole nother process that occurs at a large corporation to develop the solutions and innovations from the insights. And so that's a whole nother strategic process that is involved as well inside the company.
I'm curious, Tony, did you ever have to give a company bad news and address, run into a conflict of interest or run into a situation where you actually had to give them information that they didn't want to receive? And how did you handle that?
Yeah, culture and internal biases play a very significant role. So how it typically would end up is, from a mindset, is we might find 600 things that people care about. 200 they knew about, 200 they kind of knew about, and 200 were completely unknown to them. Probably the biggest one I can give a real story to is McDonald's. One of the things we found there was, and I give you a sense of why it was so hard for them to accept, because of their just incredible value system. What we found was that people, this is historical now, I mean, at this point, it's a very different environment, but this one always stands out. What we found in that data was that people actually thought that McDonald's was, in some respects, preying on children because they were marketing Happy Meals and toys to children who may not fully grasp the food they're eating. And at that time, it was viewed that the food might not be safe. And we all know McDonald's done massive to add salads and healthy options in their meal programs. But that was very hard for them to accept, because if you've ever visited their headquarters at the time, they had statues of children and mothers. They were all about family. They were all about children. They were all about contributing to society through Ronald McDonald House. So it's very disheartening and hurtful almost for them at the beginning to say, how can we be perceived like this is exactly what we aren't? But eventually they understood that perception is reality. If people perceived them to be that way, then they needed to address it. And they did take significant efforts to alter their advertising campaigns, their Happy Meal programs, even just how they communicated about their products and what their products were. That was one that I was stuck with me because it really just was so significant to their core values.
And Tony, I'm going to hop in with one more question, and then I'm going to let Abram take it away again.
Yeah.
So one question, or I'll start by talking about what you mentioned earlier. You said you stopped thinking about yourself and you started thinking about the change that you're trying to create. And one thing that you mentioned, you said that you were in your 20s, right? And so many millennials like myself, it's so easy to get into that mindset of, oh man, I want to try this new thing, but this, or I want to do this, but you're nervous, all these different questions coming into your brain, and you're leading some big name clients that you mentioned. So with that in mind, did you find that this was a common theme in the organization? Like, did other people struggle with that as well? Or do you think it was just kind of you and you figured it out on your own how to navigate that process?
Yeah, well, we all had it, but it manifested differently. And I think it kind of ties to some of the probably biggest learnings I had very early on. So one of the biggest learnings I had in the mindset was, I know many of you, as you embark potentially in a career or a journey of innovation and entrepreneurship, or just your careers, the mindset is that you would do so much better if you just had these resources, and the resources could be anything: financial, connections, relationships, knowledge. The resources are broad. They're very, very broad. And the call to action I would have and suggest is to think of it a very different way. The mindset is to think of it as being focused on being resourceful. You will never have all the resources you require to be able to launch the organization, to grow the organization. And what I call it is you keep getting ready to get ready. In other words, well, once I have this, then I'll be able to move on. Once I have this, I'll move on. And it sabotages. Now, I bring that up in two domains. First is a little bit is you're self-sabotaging because you're a little fearful. And if you just start unlocking it and saying, look, I'm never going to have everything I need, but if I continue to think about the outcome and the why, you will unlock your brain's innovative capabilities and be resourceful. Now, let me give you an example. When I started this project 20 plus years ago, the word data science did not exist. AI did not exist. I still look back and think, what on earth was I thinking about going and talking about algorithms and data science, right? So you can imagine investors would say, I don't know what you're talking about, and I'm not really sure how it could add value. And at a certain point, I decided to be resourceful. Instead of asking investment, I went to the companies whose problems I was going to solve. And now, again, the why was because I wanted them to make better products for society. I truly believed they wanted to do the right thing. So I went to them and I asked them if they would buy the product, even though I hadn't finished building it. And they basically bought the product. So the ability to be resourceful, I had 3 major clients, multi-million-dollar engagements, and I had 2 people. We did not have the product finished. They invested in the promise of it. Now, just think of that. I would imagine if you started thinking, yeah, some corporation's going to give me 3 or 4 million each to start a product that doesn't exist on the ability. That's resourcefulness. We tried it and it worked. I've been in Fortune companies. We never had enough resources. So don't allow that to be an impediment to moving forward and realizing your dreams and aspirations to create something, be it a job, a company, a role in your journeys.
Abram, I might inject a question here. One of the things I think our students struggle with is here to there.
Mm-hmm.
And how do they do here to there? And certainly resources is part of it. But what would make up the constellation of those resources? What should they be looking to? If you had to say, you start with these 3 things or 4 things, what would you tell them to start with? If they're going from, I have a really great idea, I think it's possible, but I don't have the resources or technical capacity to really implement it.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing I would say is that the most important resource is relationships. And that may sound so, I mean, think of it, the product wasn't developed, but the relationships fostered the investment for the products to be developed. And so first and foremost, that the relationship with the customer to validate that the need exists, right? And so I'd say the first order of importance in regards to here to there is building the relationships to test and understand if your concept and your idea actually has value to solve a problem. I would have known right away. If 4 or 5 of them said no, I would either altered the product, adjusted the thinking, or realized that wasn't a good market.
Yeah.
That's the first question. The second one then becomes, now that I understand there's a need and that there's resonance and demand, then you'll find that you start to unlock, what do I need? And it will vary. It will vary by every business. It could be contractual relationships. It could be lawyers to protect your IP before you've even created it. It could be developers to, in fact, develop it. But that first step, I think, is the most important resource, the building of the relationships. Now many might think, you're young, and how am I supposed to build those relationships? I don't know people. I don't know who to reach out to. I go back to the first thing. If you think less about you and more about the why, what problems you're trying to solve, you'll find that you will have all of a sudden the language will come out, the confidence will come out, the passion will come out. And by the way, that's the single most important reason why anyone would want to talk to you. Passion, commitment, the why is answered. You will get those relationships built just showing that.
Thanks, Tony. I wonder if we could maybe switch our attention and move forward to talking about innovation in your field. And if you'll indulge me, I'd like to suggest a frame that feel free to dispense with if it's not productive. In a HBR, a Harvard Business Review article, Joel Shapiro, he's an associate professor at Kellogg Management School, said that data analytics is really good at identifying what's. So you find a point of interest, and then you have to use more qualitative methods to find out what that means. And here I think of the classic example that Clayton Christensen talks about with McDonald's. Everybody was buying, most of their milkshakes were being sold in the morning during breakfast hours, and they thought, how could this be? And they had no way of knowing through the data. They had to go interview people, and they figured out it was the perfect food for a commute because it doesn't have crumbs and it lasts a long time, right? And that led to all these changes with their products. Now, hearing you talk already today, I'm getting the sense with the kind of tools you have and the kind of approach you're taking now, you might already be able to get there. You could correlate sentiment analysis with time of day of post and all these kinds of things. I'd love to hear what's the state of the art. Where are you at with being able to integrate context, the whys, with the what's of points of interest that might have to do with particular issues or topics?
Yeah. So I think the key thing that differentiates. So the comments and the background you gave were very telling. And I think that's because the mental model around data science was historically numbers and data. Our work in the area we continue to work on is approaching it very differently. The approach is to understand first and foremost what I'll call cognitive and neuroscience. Why do people do what they do? What drives their decision making? And then look for those indicators as in the data and in the information. So here's a good example. What we know is that people start getting very concerned, angry, and outraged when they feel things are unfair, when they feel they don't have control. They fear that some susceptible group is somehow being negatively impacted. Now, that might seem far-stretched from a corporation, but not at all. Maybe a company they feel is charging too much for the product. Maybe companies providing a product where the consumer's taking all the risk because they don't have the right return policies. And if you try to get your money back, you don't get it. These are nuances of when people feel things aren't fair, right? Or maybe how the company's operating, where they're opening, how they're opening places. That's unfair. So what our analysis is not just looking at ones and zeros and numbers, it's looking at the presence of something we know is important in our neurological decision making. So we look for when is there information showing that you feel there's a sense of lack of fairness, that there's no controllability, that things are being done to you involuntarily. So the importance of that is it helps you know in the beginning why those measures are important, or else you run into exactly what you said. You measure something and you say, well, okay, and then you get into the world of lying with statistics. You can make it look whatever way you want to give the solution. But if you understand first what is driving human behavior and then apply your algorithms to measuring those because they've been validated, then when you get the outputs, you can understand this is why. They're behaving this way because they have this feeling or they see things this way. Otherwise, you'd never know. You wouldn't know what it's trying to tell you. I hope that kind of gives a window into it. And I think it ties into the concept of how I think and have thought of innovation. Most think of innovation within a specific domain, what's going on in data science. I think those are small innovations. Those are small I. Where I think innovation really occurs, and I always say this, is at the intersection of disciplines. So it's where what you're doing crosses over to other disciplines. And so ours was how data science crosses over into human behavior and predicting human behavior, but then it also crosses into neuroscience and cognitive sciences. So that's quite different than just data science itself on a new statistical or more accurate technique of analyzing data. Why do I say that's important? I find at times in their innovation journey, you may constrain yourself by focusing deep only in your area of knowledge. It's critically important to take those corollary type courses in your 4 years. There's a reason why the programs say you have to have electives. Take those electives to give you experience and exposure to other areas, because chances are you won't be innovating in the area you took. You'll be innovating in how that area crosses into another discipline, how it helps solve a problem in another area.
I have a question for you, Tony. So one of the things, the students know the concept. They know, okay, interdisciplinary is important. Our student center was built, our Innovation Student Center was built around interdisciplinary, right? Then how do they do that? Where do they start? What questions might they ask? Are there core areas of interdisciplinary that you would always incorporate as part of your scientific and technical study?
Yeah, well, I think you have to have some foundational. So for example, I can speak to ours, the first question you'd ask is, how does the skill set that's core to me? So let's say you're coming out of engineering or data science or business, and you're looking at another discipline like public health, or you're looking at communications, a different discipline that you might take a class in. The first thing is, how can the skills or the knowledge that I gained in my area of discipline solve a problem in that area? And so what are those problems? What are the problems they're solving, and how can I bring something to bear, right? So that would be the first thing. I think foundationally, it would be consistent with those foundational courses in your area of discipline, right? So if you're in engineering, you have a core curriculum. It's not so much what those courses are. Those are well defined. It's what problems can those disciplines solve in the other area. right?
Yes.
Yeah. And so that allows for the portability. That allows for the discovery in the other areas.
I like the term portability. I think portability is a good term that our students can attach to and understand, oh, that's what this is called. I start with my area of discipline, and then I have to think about portability. What problems am I solving with this idea? And then who do I need to pull in to solve them? That's a really fabulous solution. Yeah.
Right. And that's why I go back to, Abram had said, how did you start off? And I said, well, quite actually, I was a scientist. I was a toxicologist. But what the portability was, the ability to assess risk, probabilities, outcomes. And that translated to probabilities of behavior. In fact, very, very analogous was what was the probability of someone being, in pathology following their oncology regime. And so you start saying, well, what affects that? And then you start realizing communications affects that. So now you have an interdisciplinary approach. How you communicate about the risks affects the behavior. And so that bridging of disciplines is a key piece. Now, one of the things, if I was the students, I'd be asking is, well, how do I get that type of exposure or knowledge or experience? I'm working within my domains, and I think that's a critical piece that many create ideas within what they know. So you look to the icons like a Zuckerberg. He created Facebook because of a problem he was trying to solve in regards to his college days. That was the domain he knew, that was his awareness, and he did a wonderful job. If you look, some of you might know Rent the Runway, right? The two women that started Rent the Runway. They were in college, they couldn't afford the dresses. Gosh, I have a problem, I can relate to it. How can I develop this? That is one very important area. You can innovate through your experiences in your current climate set, but don't underestimate in those early years, taking roles or positions that maybe you might think, well, I'm not going to do this for 20 years, but can expose you to new areas of knowledge that might allow you to innovate in those first few years. And I think that's a critical area of gaining more insights as to what problems you might solve, what innovations you might bring to bear, or where you can apply your knowledge to create solutions in different areas.
Wow, I really like that because for me, it makes me think of how so many, I'd say undergraduate students and graduate students, it's so easy for us to kind of sing in our little pods. We study with the other people in our class, but what would it look like to engage in conversation and dialogue and projects with other people within different majors? And how can we learn more about these other professions that might help us later on down the line? And it reminds me of what you said, the first or the key resource is building relationships and inviting other people in, inviting other people who might bring something different.
Right. And Nikaya, that diversity of disciplines is also diversity of thought. In other words, even within your pods, we come with different experiences, we come with different backgrounds, we think of things differently. So it's not only the disciplines itself, but just the fundamental diversity of thought, how we think of things because of who we are, our backgrounds, our experiences. So you don't have to have 20 years experience to provide diversity of thought that leads to innovations, discoveries, and breakthroughs. And within your own ecosystem, you first can find numerous problems that you could innovate against that are salient to a college student. And you can gain more insights by crossing those disciplines. But I'll also add, even in your first early years of a school or of a job, think of those, approach those. The way you want to think about them is, how are they diversifying my way of thinking such that I can lead to more creativity and innovation? It doesn't have to be in those first 2 years that you solve every problem. It took me about 5 years to grasp enough, to get enough in my mind of experience from toxicology to business to different areas to then one day be able to piece it together for an innovation. Now, that doesn't mean you couldn't do it just within your college experiences like Mark Zuckerberg did or Jennifer did at Rent the Runway. But those are very, very different examples and one, very, very hard to emulate, right?
Tony, do you mind if I also piggyback on that one and connect with something? For our students as well, we're looking at the labor market, and within the pandemic and COVID, there was a lot of internships that went back, jobs that they were about to have that didn't happen. And when we talked to you previously, you talked about the difference between having resources, but also being resourceful, like
Yes.
having this capacity to connect things. And I am really appreciative that you're bringing that to our students, because we spoke with the job market, and the job market actually saying, oh, we don't want the experts. We actually want the college students who are now thriving in the ambiguity, thriving on not having technical resources, but being resourceful towards like this complexity. And I am very, very grateful that you opened the door here for our students. How do we work this? How do we help students to believe in this?
Well, I think the greatest asset that your students have, that everyone values. And so when we bring in new students into the different companies I've started and own, the greatest asset they have is the fact that they don't think like any of the people we currently have.
Yeah, exactly.
The ability, sorry for a little detailed, but I really want to amplify this because I know that many of your students may struggle to see how can they add value? How can they, with little experience, make such a difference? I would probably say that the newer graduates that we bring into our companies are by far the most significant creators of innovations and discovery. I'll give you an example, and this is quite remarkable. We had intern, we took a shot, and we had high school students intern. And now you might think that's pretty interesting. And I use this as just as an example. So we had high school interns. Now, one of the biggest things in data science that you struggle with when you do this very elaborate process is you analyze an extraordinary amount of data, and then you have to label what these groupings are. Like, you have a bunch of documents that come together. It is a very, very difficult process, still yet undiscovered. There's like 5 universities work together to try to figure this out, to automate it. So you have 1 million documents, they group into clusters, and then you have to label them. And no one's been able to figure out how to do it. Now think of this, the ingenuity of the high school students. We had them physically label them by hand. Go in, read them, put a label. Go in, read them, put a label. They got so annoyed at how boring this job was. They came up with a new analytical process that has now been submitted for patent. These are high school students. So the ingenuity and resourcefulness sometimes could be that you just won't stand the norm. You just don't want to do this. And so from your students listening here, the greatest asset you have is that you're not like all those people that have already been hired, that you're coming in with a different way of thinking, and that is your greatest strength, that you're bringing those additional thoughts. Now, if you feel uncomfortable with the fact that you may bring those forward and maybe 1 or 2 isn't right, realize that you're being hired for guiding change, new ideas. Companies are willing to accept. 5 of them will not be. That's okay, we know. But there will be that one nugget that you bring out that makes a massive difference. And that's what they're looking for. That's what they're looking for. That's what we look for.
Tony, you bring up a really important point. I was interviewing Lance LeDuc this morning, who is another innovator with Carnegie Mellon in the music department. He'll be speaking in the spring. And it was clear one of the qualities of an innovator he brought up was impatience. And
Yes.
I think impatience is a real, and I think there's been a lot of criticism, and I feel unfairly so, about that iGen, right? About that next generation of young people. Well, they need to earn it, they need to work their way in, they need to be patient. And I think we really have to be willing to overturn all those assumptions. So I want to ask you, what assumptions should students be overturning that have been made about them and about the journey that they're taking?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing I'd say is you're absolutely correct. One of the mantras we had was, what I hate, I automate. And so the idea was, it was just our stubbornness that I don't want to do these things manually. I don't want to read all this information 20 years ago. So what I hate, I automate. And so, and then the challenge is the mindsets there was not following the norm that it couldn't be. And so, I mean, every innovator always challenges the status quo. That's always a difficult thing to do because status quo is very difficult to change. But I always feel the next generation, like your students, are the ones that are going to save us, because there's a lot of assumptions in business right now. You can't do this, you can't do that, you can't apply things. They're the generation that'll question all of those. The magnitude of what they can question and not accept is absolutely enormous. It will vary to the area of your passion. Some of you will question, why can't a business make products that are absolutely positive for the environment? Some will make, why can't a company work under the format that it brings to bear new medicines at very low prices that are affordable? These are all business models that have historically been in place that your generation will question. And the reason they'll question, I think the power is that the new generation has a critical asset that was less present historically. You have a valuable asset that you understand that society is a critical stakeholder in business. That business onto its own is not the only stakeholder. That it's government, society, and business. And the interrelationship of the three needs to be properly balanced. That's a norm that I think that you can challenge in regards to society has a voice. And as such, the two can work collaboratively. And I think that's where most of the future innovations will occur. Good for business, good for society.
I want to push you a little further even. Okay, so absolutely right. Students need to challenge assumptions. I think they offer this wonderful opportunity. And they really struggle for, how do I do that in a way that's safe, inviting, and particularly with people who are years older than I am, and companies that have lots more experience. If my gut is telling me I need to question this, how do I invite myself in?
Yes, seek to understand first, as Kavi always said, right? Seek to understand first. And how do you understand? Because the areas there that might be problematic is you don't know what you don't know. Well, how do you overcome that with someone that may have had 20, 30 years of experience? You ask questions. You seek to understand. You seek to learn. Implicit in there, you will bring forth answers that don't possibly hold anymore. And there's the window. There's the window for engagement. If you try to project your views and make statements about what's wrong, it'll be faced with rejection. It'll be faced with resistance. But through questioning and really authentically saying, I may not know, I'm going to ask questions to learn. If that's how it's provided, people with a lot of experience will be answering them very much focused on this individual really is genuinely trying to learn. And through that process, they will come to grips with, well, maybe that wasn't really a good way to think about it. How do you think about it? And there's the opportunity to enter into an engaging conversation. I go back to the first element, that there is a desire and a need and a wanting to have new students come in with new ideas and new ways of thinking. If you can execute it in a manner that's respectful and seeking to understand, you won't be perceived as challenging. You'll be perceived as trying to help.
Tony, I'd love to ask you, as we're thinking about innovation in your industry, you talked about the idea that right now it's the overlapping interdisciplinarity. Could you maybe speak a bit about what is already core to the field? You know, I would imagine things like consumer research, economic behaviorism, choice, those kinds of things. But you also indicated that, it's become growing in the area of how do we shape public behavior, policy questions, health questions. Where do you see the field now, and where do you see it going in the next 10 years?
Yeah, I think a lot of the field has been very focused on the analytical capabilities and tool sets. I think what we're going to see over the next decade is a real fundamental implementation around decision making. So, you needed the technology and the capabilities, from cloud infrastructure to big data infrastructure to statistical tool sets to code like Python and R. If it's not something some of the students are familiar with, they can take a look at it. Python is the new, more modern version of data science code. R is a statistical code that's really critical. And I think some may have used it in some of your classes. But so that's been the big focus, right? Just fundamentally building the capabilities. Where I see the next 10 years is how these get implemented in a whole variety of industries to include or to drive better decisions, more accurate decisions, to factor those in. So what does that look like? What drugs might have adverse effect? What communications would get people to behave the right way to prevent the spread of COVID, right? How to use data to analyze their perceptions so that you can foster better communication so that they see the risk commensurate with the real risk, right? And therefore, they behave the proper way. Those analytics can be used in virtually every industry, but those are just a couple, and I can go further. But the decision making. So if you were to think about the field of data science, it's moved from the analytical, the fundamental technical components, to how it fits into decisions across all industry applications. And so I would be asking, if I were one of your students, is how will I look to how data science and analytics applies to areas that I might wish to pursue in the future? It could be anything. It could be real estate, insurance, medical. How will data science fundamentally shift decision making in those areas, right?
I could briefly follow up on that. Where would you say the field is right now with regard to decision making? I'm thinking of like the interface, like a dashboard. The model that comes to mind is I'm a day trader and I have my data and it's already geared to allow me to make decisions. Is that fundamentally a custom designed thing for situations, or are there models that people are looking at to help figure out how to do this?
Yeah, the dashboards that exist, as you're talking about, like visualizations, for others, just think of something like as simple as a stock market and all the lines. Those are visualizations of data. It's not much different, but no, the field of actual decision making is still very embryonic. The field of taking that data into decision support dashboards and software is very embryonic. Now, this is an area where I'm spending a lot, investing a lot of our time. How can we not have a big gap between the insight and the action? So like just simply, if one has analytics that say people are perceiving your products as not safe, or your business decisions, even right now in our current climate, if people aren't perceiving your organization, your leadership as being responsible in regards to societal concerns around diversity and justice, well, you want to know that, but how long will it take you to execute on that? So the point is, how can you get that information, and how can you let that information drive instantaneous actions by a company? And that could vary in regards to how it's achieved. So our work is focusing on the analytics itself is a solved problem. The problem now is, how do those analytics drive instantaneous action or decision making that represent how the human mind, or you as an expert, would make that decision? Does that make sense? Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's so compelling. A lot of folks I've talked to are professionals. This is the concern, is how do we make decisions? How do we know that we may think we want to do this, but we're not recognizing how it's affecting other domains and all these kinds of issues? I think now
you get into a very, very large, which is the power of these capabilities to be able to scenario out the unintended consequences. See, so it's very, very difficult, no matter what your expertise, to just make a decision without grasping the complex matrix of other unintended consequences, right? And so the ability to give a computer and certain type of analytical techniques to give you a purview into some of those downstream is incredibly important, and a very important path into this capabilities. You also get unintended ethical consequences of how you built it and what might be the manifestations. And so those are very challenging dilemmas still for the field, the ethical use of these technologies.
Tony, I might follow up a little bit. I'm thinking I'm a student. This sounds fascinating to me, but I'm not a computer software type of student, but I'm interested in studying the types of problems you discuss. Can you talk about the scope and scale of the people you include in your team and how you recruit them and connect with students? If our student population was interested in that, what should they be doing? What should they be looking for? How would they prepare themselves?
Yeah. So kind of the scope, because it's no one single role or one single skill set or person. It really is an entire team. And so you have people that add great value by simply grasping the problem that a customer or an organization has. So those skill sets are being able to ask questions, understand their use cases. How do they do work now? What are their workflows? So there's skill sets on that area. Now you might say, well, how does that apply to data science? Well, data science is then pointed to solve those, right? So the first thing is, what is their problem? So that's an ability to get into a field where you're looking at how data science and analytics can provide value to a customer segment. So there's that lane. When that lane is working, so you might come with a business background. You may have no data background. You're in a business background. The next layer then is, well, how might you design a solution? Think about all the design thinking and the creativity that goes in. Again, you still don't have any data science background. Then you get into, well, what's the right data we might need? That's a solutioner, someone that might have technical background. Then it comes to the lane, as I call it, the lane in the road, which is someone that'll convert that into data science questions and then look at how to solve it. But the data scientists are not the individuals that actually do that solutioning. They're the ones that actually figure out how to solve the question and the problem that was presented to them by a business person, an expert in a different area, and then they solve it. A good example, we were working on a project to help with, in this crisis, the potential increase in suicide. And so, you have to start with the physicians, the people that have experience in understanding what are the markers of suicide. Then you work into, well, how would you detect it? How would you then build a solution for it? And then you give that to a data scientist. And then the data scientist starts looking at the data. And so it's always about 2 to 3 steps removed before. Where am I going to get the data? Well, you have to have technology engineers to be able to provide that data, and data engineers. So there is a lane for everyone to play, even if you're not a data scientist. And I say that because that is a great area of great growth. So there's a lot of jobs in that area. And there's a lot of roles beside just the data scientist. This is actually an area that comes up a lot. People say, well, I want to get into consulting. I want to do management consulting. I want to do things, but I'm not a data scientist. So this ability to understand how it still relates to the use of data to solve those problems is critical. That's where you can fit in many, many places.
Yeah.
Right.
I think this would be a great time. Nakaya, I think there's a couple questions. Maybe we could start with the one about starting a business.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a question from Tom, and Tom said, I would like to know one of the biggest lessons you learned since starting your own business. Do you have any advice for Tom? You've talked about a lot of great points, including, resources and mindset. But what would be some additional advice that you would give to a student, or this could be a staff member or a faculty member? How would someone get started with launching their business?
Yeah, well, I think 2 things there. One, biggest lesson in how we get started. I think they kind of come together, because I think what's critically important that I learned was to validate your hypothesis right up front, to really talk to who you're selling to. I see a great amount of times, and sometimes I've done it right, sometimes I've done it wrong, where we think we know what the solution should be or what they want. And it usually isn't. So, you end up over engineering it. You end up, especially if you're an expert, you end up over engineering it. You end up too simple, although that one tends to be most successful, more successful than the over engineering. We always look at even the Apple iPhone. There's numerous precursors to that all failed because they were heavily engineered. Some of the students probably never remember that, but there were previous versions of those little devices. The Newton that came out that Apple did and failed miserably, and so they over-engineered until they realized what consumers really wanted. So test the hypotheses. You don't have to do massive research. It's like measuring twice before you start. Know that you most likely won't get it right. Your business as you start out won't be your real business. You will have to be pretty flexible that you may have gotten a part of it right, but it wasn't quite right. And so what you thought your business was going to be actually ends up being different. So, even when we look at the big icons like Facebook and others, I'm not sure they thought they were going to be an advertising company, right? They were going to be a social media platform for connectivity. Their revenue model hadn't been defined. And so this ability to be really grasp that you probably don't have it right. The best analogy I can give you is something I learned early on is when a pilot is flying a plane. I was telling them the story, the journey of an entrepreneur. And I was sharing, you kind of don't quite know exactly what the business model is going to be. You have a directional thought, you test it, you get feedback, etc. And by the way, that feedback's even before you develop the product, just feedback on the concept. So the pilot said to me, "Oh yeah, that's like when we fly planes." And I was like, "How does that similar to fly planes?" He goes, "Well, we know we got to get from point A to point B, but a good amount of time, we're never on the right flight path. What we do is just readjust because the winds always take us off. So our job is to put ourselves back on the right flight path." And I'd say that's very analogous to an entrepreneur. You don't exactly know. You get blown off path. You have to recalibrate, but always look towards where you want to end up. And here's the big thing, Nakaya. You have to understand, where do you want to end up? What do you want to create? What are you trying to achieve? Do you want a big company? You want to sell it? You want a small company, a family company? What do you want to achieve? That's a critical question to ask right out of the gate. So biggest lesson, you're probably not going to get it right. And to be flexible on that business model and test your hypotheses before you launch these big ships.
Mm-hmm. Tony, if I could jump on that, one of the other questions in the chat here is about, if I'm a student now, the job I may have 5-10 years from now may not even exist. We've heard this before, right? That the jobs of tomorrow don't yet exist. I wonder if you'd extend this analogy, a business, you have to keep steering to where you hope to go. How do you define for yourself a sense of purpose that can carry you through starting off in one field and ending up in another, or doing an early stint at a company to learn what you don't know in order to be ready to start a business? What for you is the kind of thing you can do to anchor yourself in a larger purpose?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing in regards to the job might be gone is to really think about it this way. It's not, will my job exist, but it's what value are you creating throughout that journey? And here's the value. If you're in college right now, what you're truly learning is how to think, how to process and think through information and to understand that. So you're learning frameworks that guide that thinking process. That is never obsolete. It's just because it's going to vary where you apply it. So 10 years from now, you may not apply it to the same things you're applying it now. But the concept that you're learning is how to think through problems, how to think through information, how to synthesize it and garner an insight and then work through a solution, a problem, or an action. That never goes away. And you may apply it differently. So I wouldn't want students to fear that I'm going to invest in this career path and then, my gosh, 10 years from now, it'll be gone and I won't have a career. The value you're gaining through that journey is how to think about things, and you can apply it anywhere. And so now you go into, you said like the why. Well, I think if you broadly define what you're trying to solve as opposed to narrowly define it, then you don't have to solve, like my area of what drove me. My parents were from Italy. They were born in Italy and they immigrated to Canada originally, and then I came to the US. And like most immigrants, they ended up working in manufacturing. Even though they had degrees and education or not, they worked in areas that were not I would say, the safest for their health back then, right? And so what drove me, the big why, was how can I play a role in being a voice for people that may in fact be exposed to unsafe conditions, unsafe chemicals.
Wow.
That's a big why. How I drive that has changed over the last 25 years. Early it was as a toxicologist. In the middle, it was how do you communicate to individuals the risks so they reduce them. And now it's more in the field of data, analyzing data to keep people safe and to make products safe and to get companies to make safer products and conditions. So the why, if you make it within the domain of more broadly and recognize you're going to solve that why very differently over the 20, 30, 40 years of your professional career. That's how I would frame it. So hopefully that helps in regards to how to see it as portable and long lasting and sustainable.
I would like, you're the second speaker. We've had 3 speakers here, and all 3 of them referred to their coming from immigrant families.
Mm.
I'm wondering if you might speak to what is it about immigrant mindset and immigrants' experience that, and having that background of difference, that really perfectly primes people to be innovators.
Yeah, well, I think the best person I've ever seen do it was the gentleman who wrote "It's a Beautiful Life" in the movie, and Benini, I think was his last.
Roberto Benini.
Roberto Benini. And if some of you haven't seen it, go Google his acceptance speech. And when he received the award, he said, "I would like to thank my parents for the greatest gift they could have ever given me." And what he said was the greatest gift they ever gave, poverty. And what he was really speaking to was, I think the immigrant background really goes back to my first comment. It makes you very resourceful. You aren't filled with all the different tools. And frankly, I would say some who have them all still don't know how to use them or leverage them or apply them. So I think immigrants, the real portable learning from that is that they didn't have much. So you have to find ways to still achieve your goals. And as such, they did, and they found those. And so I think that drives a lot of success. I think in the modern days now, I'm sure many of your students have read books about grit and resilience. And that grit comes from a deep passion of making the difference you want to make. And I think a lot of the immigrants with few resources have that grit and resilience. Even if they don't have it, they're going to work through it. And so that's why I may have said it a few times, resourcefulness is the critical asset in that journey. Oh, I think you're on mute, Ibram.
Thank you. Tony, if we look ahead and we look to students who maybe are interested in looking for internships, interviewing, you've talked a little bit about some issues, but I wonder, what's it like for you if you do have an opportunity to hire someone or bring someone in an internship? What are the things that make a good impression on you when you're across the desk and you have somebody come in to talk with you?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say, I can completely, relate, to many of the students that might thinking, wow, what a tumultuous environment for job prospects, right? And, I have my own kids there in college, and I too, share the concerns of what might it look like for this generation. And I would advise this as one, how to think about it, and two, what attracts us. The first thing is from a standpoint of be very open to it from a learning experience. So in other words, think of any internship or any opportunity at this period of time as a key time to learn. And what I mean by that is your conversations may not be focused solely on, does a company have a job? Does a company have an opportunity? But can you stay connected and learn just the same by talking to them, getting time with them? Use the time you may have now to have those dialogues. We're having a dialogue right now. My hope is that there's great learning. Imagine having 20 of these over 6 months where you've had seeked to understand. That would be as important. Frankly, it might be even more important than the actual internship work, because you're getting deep insights through a conversation that could shape it. Now, so that's the first thing, just how to think about it right now. Learning, free opportunities, any type of opportunities. What I look for is someone that has first a very curious mind, right? Someone that has a curious mind and just an insatiable appetite to learn and ask questions and go back to the point that they don't accept things for what they are. I know they may be out of context sometimes, but I also know that they're going to be creative and think of it differently. What I'm looking for is someone to come in who isn't like everybody else. If that's the case, because I'm not getting all my problems solved, right? So I'm looking for these students to come in for new ideas, new ways of thinking. Their only ability to do that is to be very curious, very like their curiosity just comes out. So that is an area. I also really value two other things. An insatiable appetite to learn. So I'm looking for that because that's a critical success factor for them innovating. If they don't seek to learn first, they're going to just give their opinion and it'll be out of context. So if they're seeking to learn first, I know they're going to come up with good ideas in context, right? So those are critical areas.
Tony, one of the things, so again, what I'm aware of is students seem to know sometimes what the right thing to do, or we're giving them advice about this, which your points are very important, curiosity and seek to learn. What types of behaviors would students exhibit? Like what would they ask? How would they approach an interview like that? What would you recommend? Yeah,
so two things. First, the first part on that is it will be driven by not being yourself focused and being more them focused. So some traits, really understand. I got to admit, I see a lot of students that might come in for an opportunity. They see data science. They don't do the work to know what do we really do. So the first thing is seek to understand before you even show up. What does the company do? What are their problems? Look at their news articles. Look at their websites about what they say. Look at anything that the executives have said. Look at their 10K reports, right? So now you've already, before you even had it, you've started to seek to understand. That's someone that's coming, really cares, wants to be there. The second thing is through questions. It's always through questions. The ability to ask questions about how the company is solving things now. What are the critical problems? That will allow you to resonate. That allows the opening for you to say how you can be helpful, where you might be able to provide value. But if you talk about value before I know that you even know what I care about, then immediately you'd be out of contact. So first do your research, understand the company, go for like a deep understanding before you go in. Because also that'll tell you if you really are interested in them. You don't want a bad fit, so nor do they. So find out first about the company. When you're in that interview, ask questions that relate to the information. How are you coping with some of these struggles? What kind of things does the company do? And you're really seeking to understand to see how you fit in. And I hope that helps in regards to how to approach it.
No, I think that often I keep teasing students, this is about navigating the high seas. And you talked about some of them: context, creativity, curiosity. Those are things that you've really focused on that I think are really helpful. And what I like is that you have given students formulas and strategies for how to do that. So we're not just saying do it, we're showing them how to do it, because that's those are the types of questions we get. How do I behave?
Right. Well, and I think the thing is, think about is how do I do the things beforehand so that I do behave properly? So you're not going to behave properly if you don't know what the company is about. You're not going to be able to behave properly if you don't know their problems. Once you know that, implicit, you will start asking, you'll be talking about the right things. Notice your behavior will be the right behavior. You will not have the right behavior if you go in and haven't done and I would say you weren't respectful to the person's time by even understanding what they do, what problems they're facing, and what problems they're trying to solve. And so by doing that, you've respected their time. You may not get the job, but you might have a relationship for a future job. So now what I hear some struggle with is, it's always that same kind of interview, right? You do all these things and it's that same interview. Well, these kind of things will fundamentally change the interview. The interview will be that way if you go in like most students, didn't do their homework, didn't check out the company, don't know why they want to be with them other than a job, don't know how it connects with their why, which means they don't have the confidence to have the conversation. If you do these things, I can assure you, it won't be an interview. It'll be a conversation, because immediately they'll start grasping to say, this individual has different ideas. They are I think they can add value to us. At least that's how, in my 30 years, I've approached it.
Fabulous, fabulous. The idea of how do we engage people in having a conversation instead of a transaction.
Yeah, if you prepare for it to be a cut and paste interview, that's what it'll be. If you prepare properly for it to be a conversation about a mutual resonance as to what you value and add value and what they find importance, it's going to be a conversation. And I can tell you 99%, those are so unique that they always end up getting the position.
Wow.
Now, Tony, I have a follow-up question for you. So we have a student by the name of Layla, and I think you pretty much touched on what she was looking for. Her question was, how can the students share their innovation to the company when some adults won't listen to them because they are young and don't have enough experience? And I think that some of your advice kind of filled those gaps, being knowledgeable, doing your research and all of that. And you can speak to a little bit more on that if you like, but I have a follow-up question to that. Now, let's say our students are really brilliant and some of them are getting, not just one, but maybe 2 offers out of college. So what are some questions that students can be asking these companies that can help them, or that will help maybe give them a little bit of ease? Like, okay, I'm going into a company where I'm going to be heard despite my age, despite me just coming out of college, because I think that these students are in situations now where they might be receiving multiple offers and they're trying to make a really big decision.
Yeah, well, so maybe we'll touch with the second one and go back to the first. So the second one is, how do you make it? Always remember, the interview process is as much you interviewing them as they are interviewing you. And that goes back to that them focused, not just yourself focused. What are you learning about them? How quickly did they respond? Who were the people that interviewed you? What was their mentality? How did they approach it? Did they show up on time? Did they keep you waiting? Did you not hear back? These are all conduct that should really tell you how they treat their people and how professional they are around the asset of human capital. And I would say to you that always select a company who values their people and the growth of their people. And there are numerous indicators of that during your interview process. Okay, that's number one. Look at it and understand it. Number two, how close and consistent is it with your core values? Frustration in your job will emanate from there's a disconnect from what your values are and the company's values are, or your boss's values are. If you want to save yourself great frustration every day, because you're not always going to save the world every day, but you can, in fact, resonate with your values every day. People are important, society is important, customers are important, doing the right things is important, collaborating with my teammates is important, having different views among a team. If you're in an environment that's consistent with your values, you'll have very little frustration and you will have that sense of fulfillment. So 1, how do they treat you? 2, are they consistent with your core values based on what you see in the company? And then you get into the other part, right? Then you get into which company has the greatest prospects for future growth, which company has greater prospects for, promotions and financial. I think, though, people put those first and then they're very unhappy because they don't have the respect they want, they're not listened to, and then that other part is it doesn't match with their value systems. And, well, then you might have gotten a good experience, like learning, but then you move on, right? And you might not have wanted that. So that was that one. And then the first one, it goes back to they won't listen to you. I'm going to say, seek to understand them first. That will open the door for them to understand your views. If you seek to understand them, they'll respect the fact that you're pretty young. You may not have had a lot of experience. What you have is innovative ideas, but those have to be harnessed and channeled to their problems. How are you going to know their problems if you didn't ask, if you didn't research, if you didn't listen? Once you listen, the doors are open. Now you can shed your best light on all of your experience and your thoughts. And then you have a real breakthrough.
Fabulous.
Well, thank you, Tony. This has been an incredible session. We're so appreciative to have you. You bring a really unparalleled mix of technical insight and insight to the process that students go through in order to be successful with their own mindsets. Thank you. I'd like to turn it to Karen now, because I think she can highlight some upcoming events, even including one you yourself will participate in. Karen?
Yeah, Mr. Sardella will be going and doing a short circuit for us next semester on the innovator's ethic, and which will be moderated by Kevin Kimley, who writes on the entrepreneur's ethic. And just to get that sense of what are the things that we should be considering as we look at that intersection between humans and technology, what are those ethical influences that we have? So please, I want you to look forward to that. Also, next week we have our flagship innovator series, Tom Strummer, who is the global manager of Accenture. And if you think about them as kind of pioneers in the intersection of talent and technology, people and technical opportunity, he is also on our Innovation Center Council. And he is going to be, like you, Tony, one of our professional practices coach.
Fantastic.
It's for our students. Two really, really wonderful things coming up for you to think about. We have two big short circuits coming up. One is Owning Your Public Voice with Lewis Carr, who is the president of media sales at Black Entertainment Television. He is also on our Student Center Council board, and also will be a flagship speaker, but he's going to be speaking on Bigger Than You Think, which is how, Tony, even more specifically, how we invite ourselves into conversations and why we should do that regularly as young people. So the other thing is a short circuit. I think our students don't want to miss this one. How to innovate television comedy that influences social change. We have the 4-time Emmy Award winner and executive producer of Modern Family and Will and Grace, Abraham Higginbotham, and that's on the 29th of October from 5 to 7 p.m. So I will remind you, one last note, we are starting a group next week called Let's Start a Fire. And it's people who are interested in fire safety and inventions around fire. So if you want to be a fire starter, please email me. My email address is on the, Nikaya will put that on the chat. And I just want to remind you, first of all, thank you, Tony. Thank you, Nikaya and Abram and Analush, and especially Spencer Braley, our technical genius. And I will just remind you that at Iowa State, Innovated Iowa State, we are innovation for anyone, anywhere. So thanks, team.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.